I am a practicing therapist at the Aurora Healing Center in Milwaukee. I also have my own private practice LLC called Ray of Light Counseling. And I have been working with survivors for somewhere around 8 to maybe 10 years through my different experiences in crisis work and in direct services. And today I'm going to be talking about male victims of female perpetrators. This is a topic that, as I'll talk about a lot in the presentation, doesn't necessarily have a lot of research, but it's one that through my own practice and work with male survivors has been something that has been very important and something that I wanted to kind of work with and bring to light. So let's do it. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
All right. Here's my play button.
Yep. There you go. Yep.
There we go. Oh, that is going to perfect.
We are
Okay,
seeing your note side. Oh, no, now we got it. Cool.
perfect.
Awesome. We're good.
All right. So male victims of female perpetrators. So we'll start with the disclaimer that this presentation is not a dismissal of female victimization. This is not a manosphere space, went forward a little bit, or anything like that. Research acknowledges that women are one of the primary victims of sexual assault. However, a lot of experiences, oh, sorry, I'm gonna go off screen. Oh, yep, sorry. A lot of experiences negate males in this space. So this is one where we're going to be talking a lot about um, females as perpetrators and men fitting into the role of survivors in a space where sexual assault is looked at through the lens of male perpetrators and female victims, but that is in no way meaning that we are dismissing the victimization of females in any way. So we'll start by going through some of the rape myths around men and sexual assault. Officially, a rape myth is a prejudicial or stereotyped or false beliefs about sexual assault, rapists, and rape victims. And they are often served to excuse sexual aggression, create hostility towards victims, and bias criminal prosecution. And while we won't be going through all of the myths, some will continue to show up throughout the presentation. Specifically, myth number one, that boys can't be sexually abused, and if one is, he can never be a real man. Myth two, that if boys experienced arousal during abuse, he wanted or enjoyed it, and if he ever did partially want the sexual experiences, then they were his fault. We'll also be looking at myth number three, sexual abuse is less harmful to boys than girls. This is a big one that is kind of makes the underpinnings for why we are so able to dismiss and kind of minimize males' experiences. And also we'll be looking at myth six, that if a female used or abused a boy, he was lucky. And if he doesn't feel that way, there's something wrong with him. So we will, again, throughout the presentation, we will come back to these myths and look at their role in creating hardships for male survivors. So when it comes to the history and some of the prevalence rates of male victimization, We start with that, research started exploring men's victimization around the late 1980s. Until then, there wasn't a lot of research exploring men as victims, and a lot of that is due to the fact that many laws didn't have space to see men as victims. Um, so what they found when they went into doing this research, that they found substantial amounts of victimization by women against men, especially when you looked at college populations, which for those that do the work, makes sense, that college populations are at high risk for sexual victimization. However, when we look at this, a lot of times we're looking at it through the lens of protecting women from predatory men in cases of intoxication, or in cases where, parties or hookup culture is taking place. When they went in, they found these prevalence rates that were kind of all over the place. Research was showing that men were reporting victimization rates anywhere from 18.5% to 70%, depending on the study. And, when you look at that, that is a huge gap. And this incredible wide range is due to a number of factors, including different definitions of sexual coercion, and the use of samples that included individuals at high risk for sexual coercion. So in many cases, you're studying college populations where the rates of victimization are already going to be high. And then you add to that that each study is using its own verbiage, whether they're using the word rape, they're using the word sexual violence, they're using the word unwanted sexual advances, and all of these different changes create different answers from those being surveyed. But when research specifically examined non-consensual intercourse with a woman, it was found that up to about 20.7% of college men have experienced at least one incident. Um, and it's important to note that these numbers also match studies that utilized self-reports by women. So you have men saying that they are experiencing somewhere around 20 to 21%, prevalence rate of unwanted sexual contact from women, and women are reporting the use of coercion and other non-consensual tactics at around, the same rates, looking at maybe like 20% for men reports to like 18 or so percent from women's reports. So, men are saying this is happening to me, and women are saying, yes, we are doing this, or I have at least participated in something that looks like this. Yet somehow, despite these numbers and an expanded understanding and acknowledgement of male victimization throughout the 2000s and into the present day, we still have research and conversations around sexual assault focusing on women as victims and men as perpetrators, despite these pretty high prevalence rates. The idea that 20% of men in a college sample are reporting that they're experiencing some form of sexual victimization by women, and that we're still focused on the women only as perpetrators, says to me that we're not paying attention. And an example of this was in 2011, the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey showed that in a 12-month period, men and women reported similar rates of non-consensual sex. So again, we have a situation where the literature and the conversation around sexual assault is saying that women are experiencing so much more victimization, yet you have a national survey that's taking the entire year and showing that men are reporting similar rates to women. But yet the fact sheet that came out summarizing the findings of that study started with women are disproportionately affected by sexual violence. And that was followed by a bullet point that pointed out that 1.3 million women were raped during the year preceding the survey. So when you look at that, you say, how are they kind of able to just skip over men? And the reason they were able to do this was due to the differing categories where women were reporting more instances of experiencing rape and men were reporting more unconsensual sex. Specifically, they were talking about forced to penetrate instances, which we'll get into later. But, you know, oh, what's that say? You can see the transcript on the recording. Okay, I'll let them take it. Anyway, so even do this different category. Yeah, so what we have are moments where women are reporting that they were raped, which when we categorize those and look at the laws on the books, you will see that reporting rape, which that word in itself carries more legal, theoretical, and political weight versus men reporting that they're experiencing non-consensual sex, even though I know for myself, when I hear the words forced to penetrate, that sounds like rape to me. That sounds like sexual assault to me, but it isn't. And we'll get into how that's even possible later. But again, we're having situations where, you know, we're keeping men in the shadows by taking their experiences of sexual assault and lowering them to a tier that then doesn't get reported as something that's actually happening, and we keep the focus on the words that will carry the most weight. So this obviously is going to create a lot of barriers for men. Specifically, when we're talking about social barriers, we talk about the concept that sexual assault is conceptualized as a crime perpetrated by men against women. And this idea is upheld by traditional gender roles that exist within a world dominated by hegemonic masculinity. And hegemonic masculinity is characterizes real men as strong, sexually assertive, heterosexual, dominant, active, and in control of their emotions. So, and men who express emotion and vulnerability within the context of hegemonic masculinity are showing weakness, and weakness is associated with femininity. So essentially, hegemonic masculinity does not allow a space for men to be victimized as females by females. And the and that because men are dominant, they should be able to take care of themselves. They should be able to resist any form of sexual violence brought against them. And since women are considered weaker than men, there's no possible way that a woman should be able to overpower a man or take advantage of a man to sexually assault him. So right there, we've created a space that is able to form the first myth that boys can't be sexually assaulted, and if they are, they're not a real man. So this, of course, creates a barrier to not only men reporting, but men feeling like they can categorize their experiences as something that is sexual assault or something that should even be felt as bad or considered bad. So this leads to, of course, the minimization of men's experiences, and conceptualizing sexual assault as a crime perpetrated by men against women leads to instances where males sexually assaulted by women will often have trouble seeing their encounters as sexual assault due to this challenging their masculine identity and beliefs that they are not supposed to show emotion or ask for help. And this leaves men particularly vulnerable to developing PTSD and other negative outcomes because in the presence of stigma and in the presence of, you know, using using negative coping or using avoidance coping, that is going to compound and lead to men experiencing more PTSD as they search for some kind of support for what's happened to them. Several studies have also shown that police and mental health professionals rate male victimization by women as less of a crime and not as bad as victimization of men by other men or victimization of women by men. And this, of course, leads to a space where we have myth number 3. Sexual abuse is less harmful to boys than girls, in a space where men are not allowed to have feelings and men are supposed to be responsive to sex. A man saying that he has been victimized by a woman will kind of be looked at as, you know, well, what is the real issue here? What's actually happened to you? And as we'll discuss later, this leads to outdated laws, unequal punishment, and a lack of supports and services, which again further silences men. When it comes to the media, movies and television normalize male victimization by showing it as something that's funny or that men are lucky to experience and at worst could consider a net positive or a slight inconvenience, which we then get into myth number 6, that men who are sexually abused by women, if you were, then you're lucky. And if you, for some reason, have a problem with that, then there must be something wrong with you. And there's many, many examples of that. One particularly that stood out to me, that is a movie that I tried to find the name, and I'm probably going to date myself in age, but I think the movie was called Can't Hardly Wait. And particularly in that movie, there is a whole scene that involves basically a woman committing a act of forced to penetrate rape on an unconscious man. And it's just kind of a part of the movie. Like it's, you know, there's the male seemed distressed about it and, you know, because there was going to be a consequence for that, if I remember correctly, but as far as like him and some romantic relationship, but the scene itself was just simply there. Like it just showed a completed forced to penetrate situation and just kind of moved on to the next space. So, you know, men who see that, you know, people who see that look at that and go, you know, that there must not be a problem with that because, you know, in the context of the movie, it was just kind of placed there. And also news portrays female perpetrators more favorably and are less likely to utilize sexual assault language when referring to male victims of female crimes. And we'll get into that a little later of where that comes from and kind of proof of how that shows up. So all of this leads to stigma, which is victim blaming messages either directly from perpetrators and others after disclosure or indirectly from society. And we know that internalized stigma constitutes a particularly increased risk factor for the development of post-traumatic stress disorder, through the creation of barriers for men to conceptualize their experiences and feel like they can reach out for help.
Aaron, we do
Mhm.
have a question.
Okay, what's that?
Someone is asking, why is there in recent years so much sexual misconduct by female educators in middle and high schools with respect to the male students that they're teaching?
I'm not sure particularly why. I do have an entire slide that gets into that, and particularly, but um, I think part of that is that we are we are shifting our understanding of victimization to include men, and I think the newer generations are starting to highlight and call that out. So it's one of those things where it's always been going on. It's just more of we are now being allowed to talk about it and categorize it, which opens up, that space for maybe us to finally decide that we're going to do something about the fact that, you know, somewhere, and we'll get into it later, but somewhere around 20% of women are utilizing their role as caregivers in some capacity to commit sexual violence. But that what gets in the way is again, that idea that we're talking about a crime that's seen as being perpetrated by men against women, and we've placed women in certain roles that makes it hard to look at that critically, I think. I don't know if that answered the question.
So far, I think it has, and thank you so much.
No problem. So when we look at the legal barriers for male victimization, we get a pretty bleak look at kind of our history in that for most states, rape laws excluded men until the 1970s, when states started to kind of take over and start to reform their laws to be more expansive to what sexual victimization looks like, and particularly to be able to include men. However, the FBI's Uniform Crime Report only removed its female specifier in 2012. So to put that into perspective, I started doing this work with survivors at the Healing Center in 2015. So it had only been 3 years since men had even been allowed to be categorized as being able to be raped on a federal level anyway. So the FBI started recording data of violent crime in the 1930s. So that means that for over 80 years, as states were reforming their laws to increase recognition of male victimization and address non-rape sexual assault, the FBI's outdated definition of rape forced states to send only a subset of their reported sexual assaults. And a specific example of this is in 2010, the city of Chicago refused to comply with the UCR's outdated categorization. So because of that, they were not included in the survey. And I'll repeat that the city of Chicago, the entire city of Chicago, all of these sexual assaults that happened in the city of Chicago during the year of 2010 were not included in the federal numbers reported by the FBI because Chicago refused to parse out their sexual assaults based on the category of the categories and remove basically male sexual assault altogether. So essentially the FBI Unified Crime Report up until probably about 2013, when it comes to sexual assault data, is essentially useless because it specifically removed men entirely. And even after the definition was changed, there was still a focus on the penetration of a victim, which by definition, then if a perpetrator must penetrate a victim in order for it to be categorized as assault, that doesn't leave space for a victim who is being made to penetrate a perpetrator. So we're still leaving out a large swath of males' experiences. And because of this, males' experiences of SA by women were defined under lighter laws that carried less penalties. So their idea of getting justice for what you essentially look at as the reverse of crimes committed against women were essentially impossible to get to. Um, and you know, often women were diverted away from official punishments as opposed to getting the type of sentences that men were getting for what was essentially the same crimes. Um, and what you get are situations like a 2017 study that took the police and victimization data for 12 countries, and that included the US, and found that while females accounted for only about 2% of the officially reported sex crimes, the victimization data reported that female perpetrators were found in 12% of cases. So the official crime reports were not matching what men were saying they were experiencing. So essentially what we have is at one point men were completely removed and not represented in the data, and then they moved up a notch to being underrepresented in the data, which is a step up, but it's not really great and it's not what we were looking for. And specifically, the focus on men as criminals excludes men from victimhood. And this is especially relevant when we're talking about the perpetrator being female. And what this leads to is a space where legal and administrative aggression can be used against men. And this occurs when someone manipulates legal and or other administrative systems in a way to be harmful to their partners or others. And this tactic is used mainly by women in intimate partner violence situations and utilizes the gender role stereotypes that we've been and will continue to talk about that exist within the criminal justice system, which leaves men uniquely vulnerable to being taken advantage of in both sexual violence and intimate partner violence situations. So, what are the effects on these male victims? You have increased alcohol use, depression, anxiety, PTSD, a profound sense of loss, decreased sense of safety in relationships. And when we specifically get into that category of boys who are sexually assaulted by women in caregiver roles, whether that's a mother, a babysitter, a teacher, or whatever, we get into a deep sense of betrayal, impairments of reality, sexual problems, increased suicide risk, and basically all of those categories go up when the male is a victim of child sexual abuse specifically by a caregiver. So what also happens is that there's a hesitancy for men to report victimization. They run the fear of not being taken seriously, or more importantly, being blamed for their role. You know, again, because if one of those myths is that if a man reacts, then he is responsible. So if you're a man and you're assaulted and you had a reaction, you got an erection or whatever that looks like, you now take the blame for that. Of course, we get into, again, hegemonic masculinity dictates that any man who's victimized in any way and has anything to say about it is less of a man. And what this can lead to is a lot of self-blame, again, particularly in those child sexual abuse situations. Men will look at themselves and say, what did I do to cause this? What did I do to make my caregiver react to me like this or do this to me? Um, Men also have trouble identifying as victims and survivors. Um, there's many studies have shown that men will report mixed feelings, particularly around sexual assault by women. And not all of men attribute their experiences as sexual assault right away. And this can result in men getting hit much later in life with the realization that something happened to them. And because of that, now they are going through kind of a readjustment of not only having to balance their masculinity, but also having to then come to terms with something that at some point they might have thought of as a good experience or, just kind of brushed away as a more serious thing and puts them in the category of being a survivor, even if they don't want to be there. Um, others do report the experiences as feeling good, or they felt that they were special for having a knowledge or a skill that other kids in their class didn't have. And this, of course, contributes to both myth 3 and 6, because you have boys reporting that sexual abuse didn't feel as bad to them, at least at that moment, and that, it was by a woman, so they should enjoy it. Of course, again, this will also lead to later in life men coming to terms with that and having to then do even more work to move through that confusion around why they thought it was okay, or why maybe someone wants them to see it as okay. So again, it just increases all of those PTSD symptoms as men are trying to figure out their experience. Um, Lack of force or violence is another big reason why men have trouble finding themselves as victims or survivors. Essentially, if no one's hurt physically, did anything really happen? Um, and also, when you have the violence specifiers, that when you're talking about laws, violence is necessary for harsher sentencing. And but we know that, or we at least studies show that use of force or violence is the least used tactic by female perpetrators. So you have an instance where men already have trouble identifying themselves as the victims of anything if there's not force or violence used against them. And then you add to that women who do perpetrate rarely use violence, and are more likely to use coercion or take advantage of intoxication. So again, men are just sitting in a limbo where they feel that what they've gone through is an assault, or they feel off kilter about it, but there's no proof that anything happened. And it's kind of looked at as something lesser. So what are they supposed to do with those deep feelings of betrayal, those deep senses of loss, and all of the things that come with that? There's also lack of services for male victims, specifically lack of dedicated services for male survivors, and that puts men in a space where they are kind of piggybacking off of the services for women, which um, those services and those spaces are not always necessarily welcoming of men, as well as, again, men are now having to rework what it means to be a man and to be masculine when they are being provided services and being in spaces where it is a majority women seeking help for something that has now happened to them, and puts them in a space where they're feeling less masculine and more feminine. Also, there is a gatekeeping of services by both service providers and female survivors, which brings me to the quote over here that being a girl is so much worse. I don't see myself as belonging. I'm not a sex offender, but I'm treated as one. And that was said to me 2 weeks ago by one of my male clients. And particularly, this client is a survivor of child sexual assault, child sex trafficking, and has had experiences with both male perpetrators and female perpetrators. And he was talking to me about how he did not feel like a survivor. He didn't feel like a victim. And in fact, he didn't like that label or any of the talk around it. And as he was looking for services, he was looking for places to get information and places to kind of figure out his experiences. He was telling me that he was thinking about going and finding workshops or other services for sex offenders. And because he just felt that that was a space where he could get production and productive, and a space where he would be able to get the answers to what he was going through. And through talking to him further, what it revealed was that he had actually been doing a lot of searching on the internet for some of the questions that he was having during the week about things that were coming up for him. And what he was running into was a lot of anger and pushback from people in the discussion threads, because he chose to be on Reddit. I don't know why, but he chose to use Reddit, and was being told that he didn't belong in that space, that it was wrong for him to ask questions, that he was probably a perpetrator. And this mixed with a lot of other experiences he's had where he was he would be searching for spaces to belong, and what he would find were he was more gravitating into spaces where um, women particularly were talking about, how bad it was to be a female survivor and how horrible men are. And some of the women within that group denied his experiences as a survivor, which led him to feel like he belonged more as a sex offender. Um, I also had another client who went through actually a forced to penetrate situation with someone who he was in a dating relationship with, and he also worked with this person. And after that happened, he spent time struggling, trying to figure out if his experience was a sexual assault. And once he decided that it was, he ended the relationship, which was good. But when he confronted that person, he confronted them um, at work. And what happened is the perpetrator, who we're talking about, a 6'9" man and about a maybe like a 5'6" to 5'8" woman, and she pushed him and punched him, and this was in the work parking lot, which he then took that to HR, and this is the HR of a service provider, and he received no help. So he left that job and struggled to kind of figure out what his experience was. So he too went looking for other service providers, and this was during the kind of height of the Me Too movement. So he went looking in internet spaces for that, for support. And what he found was that he was told that, how dare you be in this space? This is not a space for you. You're here trying to mess this up. You're in here trying to do something bad, and he was receiving these comments from people who were from women who were very comfortable not only saying that they were survivors, but that they were also service providers, and that they knew that what he was talking about did not happen, it could not happen, and that he was just lying to try to infiltrate that space. So it took him a while to really come to terms with himself as a survivor as well, and led to a lot of struggles where he just did not feel like he could kind of get a foothold in the space. Though I am glad to say that he is doing better with that, and that he has been kind of a strong force in pushing for men to be recognized as victims, specifically men who are the victims of female perpetration. But those are just two stories, particularly from my work, that shows that this does show up in spaces, and that when men do show up in these places, they are treated with a level of stigma, and the focus very much can become, how do we keep the women in this space safe from men, but these men that we're talking about are other survivors who have been through similar things and are looking for support, and they're kind of being told that you're a perpetrator. This is not a space for you. So we'll kind of get into recommendations for that, but wanted to utilize those stories because, it's not very often that you're doing a presentation on male victimization by females and a client says something so powerful to you. So I felt the need to put that in there. Kind of finally, as the effects, confusion around sexuality can come up for those that are assaulted by females. We find that this shows up a lot more in men that are assaulted by other men because of the then added homophobia that comes into play. But because of myth 6 that says that men should enjoy sexual contact from women in any case, and if they don't, there's something wrong with them, men who do come to the point where they can understand that they feel some incongruence about what happened to them find themselves wondering, why didn't I want this? Why am I having this different reaction? And begin challenging whether they themselves might be gay, or whether there's might be something wrong with them, and leads again to further stigma, further isolation, and increase in PTSD symptoms. So we've talked about men as victims. Before I get into the women as perpetrators part, were there any questions, or did anybody have any questions?
So far, no more questions in the chat, Aaron.
All right, cool. All right, so when we look at women as perpetrators, we know that female perpetrated sexual assault and childhood sexual assault create a societal taboo where sexually abusive women undermine social perceptions of femininity due to the tendency to define women as caregivers and as victims. They also undermine traditional sexual scripts, which again show men as sexually aggressive, dominant, stoic, and always ready and willing to engage in heterosexual sex, while women are sexually passive, weak, innocent, emotional, and need protection. So essentially, women can't be rapists because they're sexually passive and weak, and also they can't be perpetrators because they're caregivers. Yet studies have shown that when women do perpetrate, they do so against children at higher rates than they do against adults. And that estimates show that women account for around 15 to 20% of child sexual abuse cases. And specifically, they offend against children in their care, as mothers, stepmothers, and babysitters, with younger female abusers somewhere around 18 to 25 years old. Prefer victims who are around age 12 to 17, and older female sexual abusers, which was categorized as around 33 to 78, target children who are under the age of 6. And again, they're using that role as caregivers to commit these crimes, which increases the symptoms for victims. So when you combine all of this, what you get is a state of implicit denial where we have data shows and proves that women perpetrate sexual abuse against children, but society has assigned women as caregivers because men are rapists and women are victims. Therefore, women cannot be rapists. And what this does, unfortunately, is that this places the burden back onto victims in the form of rape myths that seek to minimize and deny male victimization. So, because we've decided that women are the ones that have to be in these roles because men can't be in these roles because they are predators and criminals, we create a space where when sexual abuse of men by women does happen, we put it in a space where, well, this is your fault. You did something, or it wasn't that big a deal to you, really. You seem fine, or, you're a man, men like sex, so this should be fine for you. All of these ways that we push this aside so we can continue to keep these scripts of women in these certain roles and keeping men in other roles. And what also happens with this is that women receive less punishment when they are found to be perpetrators, and they receive shorter sentences. Particularly, one study on sex offenders found that men received prison 24% more than women, despite only an 8% difference in sentencing eligibility. They also received 20 months longer sentences and 5 months longer probation periods. So essentially, when you have a man and a woman who go into a courtroom and they are both being charged with the same crime and can receive jail time, men are 24% more likely to receive jail time. And if a woman does receive jail time, her sentence is going to be around 20 months shorter than a male's, and she'll be on probation for less time. And as examples of this, again, the universe must have wanted me to do this presentation because they dropped all of this on me within the month of March. I believe all of these are from March. And when you look at the headlines, what you see is, 31-year-old Connecticut married lunch lady. Why does it matter that she's married and that she's a lunch lady? Arrested for having sex with, sorry, there's a thing in my way. There we go. Having sex with a 14-year-old boy and sending him nudes. So much of that information is not necessary, and the key missing from that is any form of the words of rape, sexual abuse, anything like that. Then you have Destiny Hillsman, 25, a Houston teacher at Holland Middle School, was arrested and charged for grooming, texting, and kissing middle school girls. And we know that the word grooming is kind of sexual assault adjacent. However, if you don't necessarily know that, then what you see is that an adult was texting and kissing, which again is sexual assault. 34-year-old teacher of the year. Why does that matter? Jacqueline Ma arrested for alleged sexual abuse of former student. So as you can see, this is the only one that even utilizes the word sexual abuse. But before that, it shows that she was the teacher of the year with a kind of glowing picture of her. Again, minimizing what the student has gone through. this one combines both of them in that a 31-year-old Colorado woman who admits to having sex with, not rape, not sexual assault, but having sex with a 13-year-old middle schooler, and having his baby won't face jail time under plea deal. So again, I can't imagine where that you would reverse this and the person would be receiving, a plea deal. I know it probably happens, but when you think about the way that things like this are portrayed in the media, the focus on her having his child and seeing that she won't face any jail time seems to be at stark contrast to what we see with male sentencing. And the final one, cheer coach Jennifer Hawkins, 45, allegedly had sex with daughter's 16-year-old boyfriend 300 times. And again, this one, when you get into the details of the situation, was that she knew this young man from, I believe, the age of like 11 or since like 11 or 12. So when the news says she had sex with her daughter's 16-year-old boyfriend 300 times, what they are describing is a pattern of sexually abusing a child from about a adolescent preteen into their late teens. And they chose to focus on how many times that they had sex and that she was a cheer coach. So again, I'm sure if we scoured the internet, we could find instances where men who committed these crimes against women were placed in this type of light. However, we see it much more when talking about female perpetrators, particularly when it comes to crimes committed against male victims. So moving into the characteristics, as discussed earlier, there's a lack of research examining female perpetrators, and of those who have, they've utilized models based on males and tried to utilize those for women. One of the kind of oldest and well-known model for looking at male male perpetration is the confluence model, and this breaks down many different risk factors for sexual aggression and places them into the categories of hostile masculinity, which is characterized by hostility towards women, adherence to rape myths, and adversarial attitudes towards relationships, and impersonal sexual orientation, which includes a tendency to view sex as a game and a preference for casual and frequent sexual activity. So the confluence model has been used to look at risk factors for males who victimize, and Bouffard et al. Created the explanatory model of female sexual coercion, which utilized many of the concepts from the confluence model. And what they found is that while the number of common risk factors for men correlated to the use of coercion in women, they did not fully explain female perpetration behavior. And the same could be said for the Schatzel-Murphy et al. Model, which took some of these specific risk factors from the confluence model and focused specifically on sociosexuality, sexual compulsion, sexual dominance, and prior sexual abuse. And they essentially found the same things, which is that these models can be used to, in some ways, look at and predict predict whether women will be sexually coercive. However, the motivations behind the behaviors of men and women vary significantly, and neither of these models that are based on men really explain and predict sexual coercion in women. So we kind of know, but everything that we know is, again, filtered through the models that we use to look at men. So here's a list of predictors of the, of all of these, the ones that have been found kind of across all research on female perpetrators. Prior experiences of sexual abuse and rape myth acceptance are the number one predictors of coercion, with child sexual abuse and or multiple instances of abuse being one of the highest predictors. So all of these, again, can be found in men, and particularly kind of just like when we talk about men, prior experience of sexual abuse and acceptance of rape myths very much correlates to women who might enact on sexual coercion. So finally, we get into what is sexual coercion. And we'll start with verbal coercion. This is defined as using verbal tactics to get another person to engage in more sexual activity than desired. This can include lies, guilt, begging, promises, threats of blackmail, bullying, and psychological pressure from the use of authority. So most of your pretty classic uses of verbal coercion. It is the most utilized form of coercion by females. And again, we've talked about that, with physical force being so low that, other ways of coercion take its place. And what we also find is that this has been seen or has kind of been theorized to be a much more socially acceptable and less obvious form of perpetration, particularly performed by friends, romantic partners, and acquaintances to the victim. And when you combine all this, you get a place where men are not able to label what has happened to them as any kind of assault because, again, there was no violence. Um, Nothing like that took place. Um, and men are reporting similar rates of victimization through verbal coercion as women are reporting using it. So again, men are saying this has happened, and women are agreeing that when they are perpetrating, they are utilizing these tactics. Um, and within this, this also includes the use of gendered strategies, which includes threats of false rape allegations and interference in the father-child relationship. We talked about earlier that the use of legal and administrative aggression in intimate partner violence is used very heavily in instances where women are perpetrating against men. And while, of course, we know that the majority of reported rapes are valid and we should be believing victims, when we get into that niche role of intimate partner violence being committed by women against men, this is where these use of these gender roles and them showing up in our court systems and justice systems is utilized against men, and men are at increased risk of having to deal with this. The next level of coercion and the kind of the second tier is exploitation of intoxication, which is taking advantage of a person when they are under the influence of drugs or alcohol. This is often paired with verbal coercion, with verbal coercion, and can even be paired with physical force. And some studies actually even found that use of intoxication was the number one reported tactic in self-reports by male victims. And as you can see, when it is paired with verbal coercion, the prevalence rates go up from somewhere in the 20s to about 42%. So, when it shows that when intoxication is when intoxication is being used, there is also probably some form of verbal coercion. And in a way, it has been theorized that alcohol kind of creates a great equalizer between the genders, where the power differential between genders is reduced during these types of sexual encounters. So women may feel more emboldened to take advantage of men in these situations, as opposed to um, a sober male.
Aaron,
Yep.
we do have a question.
All right.
Are there any policies around holding female perpetrators accountable?
Policies. Um, I mean, that within the law, there are like, when you go further down from, class A felonies down, there are ways that, unless there is a specific identifier or specifier that removes it, that women can be charged for these things. However, kind of like we've talked about, you're getting, you're going down to, lighter jail sentences, no jail sentences, probation, things like that. So so women being held accountable looks much different than men being held accountable, because what we expect in a lot of those situations is that there will be jail time, there will be some sort of, you know, we'll see something happening to this person, where when you look at what happens to female perpetrators, they are diverted away from jail and, are usually given the chance to kind of just integrate back into society. Whereas we make sure that we hold men up and hold them more accountable, and that we see we see our justice systems doing that. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they were talking about big policy, like legislation, or like small policy in terms of um, like office or like smaller location policies. But if there's any clarifying things that they have, I will let you know.
Okay. Getting in like to smaller policy, like, I mean, like in the case with my client, something absolutely should have been done about that. I mean, that was a physical assault on workplace property. However, we then get into that when we look at violence as being perpetrated by men against women, we look at the power differentials of, my client being a, you know, 6 foot, 8, 6'9" male, and someone and says, a woman literally half his size, you know, punched him and assaulted him. Just the use of the word assault, you know, makes certain eyes roll, and like, yeah, okay, like, what really happened to you? And, you know, unfortunately, that's kind of a place by place kind of thing. I've heard of, companies taking stuff like that seriously, and, you know, doing what they can to stand with, their employees, regardless of any sort of social taboos or anything like that. And then I've seen instances like what happened to my client, where it's kind of like nothing happened to you. Like, you're a man, suck it up. You can't be harmed by them. What are you talking about? So it's kind of a place by place, but I believe that, as we continue to progress, and, you know, the workforce gets filled maybe more with, millennial, Gen Z, things like that, that those who are kind of at the forefront of redefining gender and redefining what, justice for things like that look like, that there'll be much more of a pressure to put accountability on instances like that, instead of kind of sweeping them under the rug to stay conforming to the kind of regular gender roles, if that makes sense, or if that answered it as well.
Yep, it did. Thank you, Aaron.
All right. So our last tactic is physical force. And as you might have guessed, this is the least utilized tactic by female perpetrators, with prevalence rates somewhere around 2.6% of men reporting the use of force by a female perpetrator. Though again, these rates might be underreported due to the stigma of a man, admitting that he was overpowered or taken advantage of by a woman. And it's pretty well understood that exploitation of intoxication and verbal coercion are the preferred methods of coercion by women. And finally, we get into the kind of the instance that is most negated at the moment, which is the force to penetrate, which force to penetrate involves a man being forced to penetrate a woman's vagina, anus, or mouth using his penis or without his consent. And the lifetime prevalence rates for force to penetrate fall around 4.8%. So what we're saying is that close to 5% of men are experiencing force to penetrate victimization at some point during their lives, which, when we looked at numbers like 20%, 40%, and things like that, might not seem as much. But when you take the number of men in Wisconsin, that comes out to around 140,000 men are somewhere around that number have experienced a forced to penetrate instance at some point in their life. So to me, that's a lot of people. And I know that when I look at the database at work, there aren't 140,000 men in our database, but there's somewhere around that number that have experienced something that I at least would classify as rape, and yet they're not showing up, and kind of all the things we've talked about that keep them from reporting that, kind of going hand in hand there. One of the biggest misconceptions around male sexual abuse is that getting an erection can only be interpreted as a sign of arousal and thus consent. And research has consistently reported that men can obtain and sustain erections even where they are not sexually aroused and or are experiencing negative emotions such as anxiety, fear, or terror. So again, when we go back to the myths, we have myth number 2, that if a boy was aroused during the abuse, he wanted it. And if he ever did partially want the sexual experience, then it was his fault. And data does not back that up. Men can have erections in many different situations, and it is not a automatic consent that a man gets an erection. So making sure to put that out there when talking about, when people try to defend that this is not a big deal. And also, when you look at studies around force to penetrate, you find higher levels of physical force paired with threats of force in men's self-report of their force to penetrate situations, which challenges previous studies around the use of force, which say that, women don't use force as a tactic, and and I believe really sheds more of a light on the experiences of men, particularly within intimate partner violence situations, that this is showing up in their experiences, and that in these cases there's likely to be a use of physical force added into the force to penetrate situations or any type of victimization that they may be going through. So finally, we get to suggestions for the future of men's services. One of the biggest things that we can do to help bring men more into the spotlight is removing and modifying language from rape and sexual assault laws that negates men's experiences. This includes removing language that focuses on the use of penetration, as well as the use of violence in order to obtain justice, similar to women who are abused by men. Again, those specific um, those specific identifiers really make it so that men do not receive kind of equal justice, and even if there is something done about their situation, they feel less like they've gotten something when, the person who did that to them gets probation, and when you see men getting long sentences for similar types of events. And Wisconsin has both the penetration and the violence focus on their first degree sexual assault. And when I looked at the surrounding states, they all did as well. Michigan was the closest. Their definition of sexual assault was very broad, which actually allowed some wiggle room for force to penetrate to be able to be um, prosecuted. However, there's that language then added a multiple participants specifier to it, which then knocked it down to probably about a fourth degree sexual assault. So again, these specifiers that dictate that someone has to be injured, gravely injured, in order to have their situation be taken seriously is one that affects women, but really affects men, and in a lot of ways just removes whole categories of their experiences. Um, Challenging the minimization of men's victimization by women in the media is important. We should be using the correct wording. We should be using words like rape, sexual assault, sexual violence to describe all perpetrators of sexual violence, especially given that men abused by women who utilize their role as caregivers are at the highest risk for developing PTSD. We should not be letting women off the hook for utilizing those specific gaps in, their gendered roles to be able to take advantage of men and young boys, and then have that burden then be placed on those young men to figure out what happened to them and be able to identify themselves as survivors. Um, we need the expansion of dedicated services for men, particularly on college campuses, because those numbers were very, very shocking. That's the first time I'd really looked at those numbers, and if um, that is a population that is at extremely high risk for experiencing sexual violence. So we should have services dedicated specifically to men, again, not men piggybacking off of women's services and having to do it that way, and that looks like more than just adding an addition to a pamphlet that on the front cover shows a woman crying surrounded by a group of women, and on the in the pamphlet is a picture of a man looking angry, or a man in a position looking like he's about to strike a woman, and then next to that is like, oh, we have male services, because that again, it places men outside of being survivors and being looked at as equal survivors, and it's, yeah, okay, yeah, you too, I guess you too. And everything that you're going to see that looks like you is going to show you victimizing a woman, and there's not really going to be space for you. So looking at making either gender neutral materials or male specific materials, as well as thinking about the names that we use for our services and our service providers. Not that there's anything wrong with having the you know women's healing circle, but to then make that oh, and we have male services, when men are going looking for places to find that universality and they constantly are seeing places that are built for women, it again reestablishes that they don't belong in this space, and that if they do, they have to give up or renegotiate parts of their masculinity in order to find a space in something that is seen as very geared towards women. Also, service providers should look at the expansion of co-gendered groups. I can speak from my own personal experiences that the first thing that I found that men who have gone through a specifically men's group and achieved that universality want is a co-gendered group, an opportunity to speak with women, speak with women survivors, and be able to support them, be able to find the commonalities in their experiences, and lend lend their support, and in a lot of ways lend their privilege to bringing light to their cause and also women's cause in sexual assault as a whole. So, that's kind of when I think about what sexual assault kind of services kind of move towards, we talk a lot about men taking responsibility and needing men to stand up as well. And we have a good crop of men who are kind of being excluded from the space because they aren't women. And that is not only doing a disservice to them, but it's doing a disservice to kind of the everything as a whole. Um, Challenging male rape myth acceptance lowers all perpetration. Again, rape myth acceptance was seen as a risk factor for both men and women when it came to looking at who was going to utilize coercion. So challenging male rape myths, which is challenging hegemonic masculinity overall, will have an effect on um, ending rape myths for everyone. And finally, looking at where research can go, future research should definitely look at female perpetrated sexual assault, should look towards creating a female specific predictor model and treatment methods, because what we have is we don't necessarily know what makes women perpetrate and why they do it. But when women are willing to see themselves as perpetrators and seek help, just like men, they find themselves going through male perpetration or finding mostly male perpetrator programs. And we know that most of those programs are built through a feminist perspective and focus on helping men to understand their privilege and understand their role in sexual violence and challenging toxic masculinity. And while that's great, that it doesn't necessarily fit with when female perpetrators to teach them about privilege and toxic masculinity when there's a whole nother thing going on with them. And finally, improving methodologies and increasing sample diversity. I didn't necessarily get into it every time I talked about a study, but these studies, the newer studies that are talking about this have to utilize a lot of older data. And even within that, most of the young college students or general population that we're talking about are white, heterosexual males and females. So studies need to be done focusing on different minority groups and kind of to really get a full picture of what male victimization by females looks like. And that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Aaron.
Ooh, I went over, sorry.
You're totally fine. There was a question, and
Mhm.
you might have answered it, but there was a question about, do you think there's something specific as service providers that we can say to boys and men that will help them feel seen and believed? Is "I believe you" enough, or is there something else we can say to support them?
I think "I believe you" is a good start. I think, there's a lot in getting into specifically what what the struggles are of those specific young men, and that, for when you look at the rape myths, they kind of ebb and flow within each male. So kind of figuring out what myths they may or may not be holding on to, and then utilize specifically challenging those myths with either data, experience, or kind of just that continual kind of pushing or showing them that, like, look, this thing that you're holding on to is really, is really kind of setting you back, and we might want to look at what it means to broaden your definition of masculinity, which is a whole kind of process in itself. But it is a good start, just recognizing them and allowing them to kind of speak openly about what their experiences are, because when it comes to men, they've gone in and out of different things, and sometimes they might have experiences that they're uniquely embarrassed about, and being able to hold space for them when they talk about those experiences can really help them to feel seen and feel like they are part of the movement.
Mhm. Great, thank you.
Mhm.
And then we have another question about, so a victim advocate is at Marquette
Mhm.
and wondering about referring male survivors to you and what that process might be.
Um, they can contact the Healing Center. Let me get I don't even remember my thing anymore. Oh, I'm still sharing my screen. Let me stop.
That's okay. I can
Um,
also Google it too.
but yeah, they could just call the Healing Center, either the main number, or they can call me directly at 414-216-3697. And I will filter them, but it's probably better to call the main office so that they can get all the paperwork taken care of. And then if they want to request my services or someone else's services, they can do that. And the more the better, because the more men that we have, we can then start doing some more men's groups, because of underreporting and the hesitancy to get to services, it takes a while to get enough men to then create a men's group, and then that men's group somehow usually becomes like several different groups. But it would be nice if we could get a run of men's groups going.
And then there's something else in the chat. Our organization is called the Women's Center, after the women who founded us, but we provide services to all genders. What's a good way of incorporating men? Uh, well, there's something in the way I can't. Men and boys in our messaging to encourage them to feel comfortable when using our services.
um Probably I would say more like a dedicated, like, either website page, or looking at materials and kind of, adding in representation for men, like specifically looking at, you know, this is what we can provide for you. These are the services we have for you. And, kind of maybe placing it more towards either the front of the website or something like that, without changing the name. We don't want it. The Women's Center is great, been around forever, love you guys. And but it's one of those things that, as a service provider, I do regularly think about, like, when I've had men who have
Mhm.
said they're looking for shelter. It's like, well, the Women's Center does serve men, and it takes them a moment to kind of get congruent with that. But putting some of that more out to the front, and when looking at, like, the way pamphlets are set up to kind of draw women in, kind of doing that same thing with the services about men, so that they know that there is a kind of separate but also equal space that they will be able to kind of utilize for their own.
Mm. Yeah, making sure that everyone knows that they can come for your services is super important. Any other questions for Erin? All right. If
Sounds good.
not, I'm going to put the link to the evaluation in the chat. Please feel free to take just a few moments and fill that out as we are evaluating our webinars now. And also, again, Vanessa will be sending that out um, after the fact. If you don't get it from here, you will see it in your email. Thank you, everyone, so very much for attending. Thank you, Aaron, for your information and your time and your
No problem.
expertise. We very much appreciate it when we have information for male survivors.
No
All right,
problem.
everyone. Thank you so much and have
Yeah.
a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.